All right. Well, good evening, everybody. Glad to be with you here live here in the LCI Green Room. I'm Jacob Winograd, host of the Biblical Anarchy podcast. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about what we're going to get into tonight. Please make sure, wherever you're watching, please make sure you're subscribed. If you haven't already to the channel, we just hit 1,900 subscribers a couple days ago, and we're creeping up on 2,000. So I'm really excited about that growth, and yeah, just appreciate everyone tuning in and appreciating what we're doing here at LTI. Of course, you can also go to libertarianchristians.com or biblicalanarchypodcast.com to find out more about what we're doing and what the show is about. And tonight we're going to get into some stuff pertaining to recent Twitter arguments and back and forths. I guess it's on YouTube too. It's been interesting watching. It's always funny in the podcast world and in the YouTube world, people doing their various reaction videos and things like that, right? Uh, People pick it. It can kind of get like a podcast inception, right? Where one person was responding to something someone else said, and they do another response, and it's like it could get a little bit crazy. But I'm going to be talking a little bit tonight about uh, some back and forth that's going on between Dave Smith, host of Part of the Problem, and Konstantin Kisin, I think is how you pronounce his last name. I forget the name of his show. Let me look it up here quick, see if I trigger nometry, I think is what it's called. It could be wrong, but I know it's trigger. It says on Twitter. Oh, yeah, here we go. I can highlight it. It says trigonometry. Yep. And I've watched this show a few times, mainly when it actually pertains to the subject for tonight's show. So they a while back, I forget how long ago this was. I think the first time I had seen him, he did a debate with Dave Smith on Michael Malice's show. But that was on the topic of Ukraine and the war there that's been going on. And I think Konstantin himself is Ukrainian or has some Ukrainian background. Again, it could be wrong, but I'm fairly certain about that. So now he's been dipping his toes more recently into the Israel-Gaza stuff, and he's hosted people from both sides. And he made this video like a week or two ago, saying that he was on the fence, but now he's made his mind up, and he's very ardently on Israel's side because the what would you say, the all the conversations he did, he analyzed all the different arguments, and it just led to only one conclusion, according to him, which was that the the Israeli government is justified in what they're doing. So I'm gonna be playing the recent. So Dave did a response video to that video, and now Konstantin Kisin did a response video to Dave's response video, and now I'm doing a response video to Konstantin's response video. So it shouldn't actually be too confusing once we get into it. But I forgot to tweet out that I'm live now. So I'm going to do that right now. We are live, just in case more people want to come and interact in the comments. So just put that out there. All right. So I'm going to do the share screen thing and share this video then. So give me 1 second. Present, share screen. Yep. And I'm going to click on this. Make sure that, yeah, there we go. All right. Those of you who are listening now, it's not going to be playing yet. Can you?
My Substack.
Can
the
you
video
hear that?
based
Just
on that
give me
article has been watched
some
more than
ones
10
in the,
million.
Give me some ones in the chat if you can hear that, and then I'm going to rewind that and start at the beginning and kind of do some response to it. ones in the chat. Or if you can't hear it, let me know. Put zeros in the chat or something. 1. All right, good. Just wanted to make sure that before we get too carried away. So we're going to maximize this, and we're going to go on and play. Oh, actually, let me rewind it the whole way. Oh, there we go, unmute.
The article outlining my stance on Israel's war has been read more than any other that I've published on my Substack. The video based on that article has been watched more than 10 million times across various platforms. The reason it resonated, I believe, is that it was widely shared by people who felt it summarized their thoughts on the conflict. However, no piece of content reaching millions of people is ever likely to go uncriticized, especially on a controversial subject like this one. The article appears to have stirred into action comedian and commentator Dave Smith, who's most known for his libertarian and anti-war views. We've crossed swords before when we debated the issue of Ukraine. I like Konstantin, and I think he's a bright guy who hosts very interesting and thoughtful conversations. He just gets this issue all wrong, Dave said when posting his response to the video. Before we begin, I want to say that I like Dave too. We have different views on many things, but having debated with him, I would say that he's smart and good at breaking down complex issues, even if I often don't agree with his conclusions. The fact that he's intelligent and able to debate ideas without descending into name-calling and bad faith arguments is a huge asset, and the reason I'm responding. The other reason is that given Dave is intelligent, I actually can't believe some of the arguments he made. He starts by claiming that I said I was arguing from first principles, but was in fact just making comparisons. He defines first principles as your foundational views that aren't derived from anything else, but that you derive the rest of your arguments from. He claims I didn't explain what my first principles were. What he appears to have missed is that I spent the entire first section of the video explaining that at the heart of the debate about Israel's war is the attack on October 7th. What you think of Israel's actions is derived from what you think of October 7th and what it was. For example, if your foundational view is that it was a terrorist attack, then the rest of your arguments naturally derive from that. If, say, your foundational view is that governments have a right and responsibility to eliminate terrorists, degrade their ability to commit further acts of terrorism, and rescue hostages from their dungeons, the rest of your arguments will derive from that.
All right, so I'm going to pause it there, and I'm going to minimize... there we go. We'll minimize that for the moment. So he said, I'm going to pull it up here because I also made a tweet thread about this earlier on Twitter. And so what I said was, in his recent response video, he continued to demonstrate his confusion regarding what first principles are. And that's what I want to talk about here. Because this was a criticism that Dave made when he did his response video, which I agreed with him. And it feels like Konstantin's doubling down on not understanding what it means to use the term first principles. So he said, quote, if your foundational view is that governments have a right and a responsibility to eliminate terrorists and degrade their ability to commit further acts of terrorism and rescue hostages from their dungeons, the rest of your argument will derive from that. That's really not a first principle. Let's break this down a little bit, because this is one of those things where, and I don't mean this to be insulting, but anyone who's done any kind of political commentary or debate knows that sometimes someone just says something that's just so wrong, and you're just I don't even know quite where to begin with that. What is first principles? Let's just start there. So first principles are self-evident truths or foundational truths, and they're not derived from other concepts or conclusions, but they're starting points for ethical or logical frameworks. Now, this doesn't mean that first principles are things you just take on faith, or although they can be, but there can be logical argumentation to them. There can be empirical data. Uh, but what it means is that it's not necessarily like contingent on some other set of beliefs that came before that, right? Like these are like, it's kind of like the first major flag you plant in the ground when you're kind of establishing like, what do I believe about the world, or at least in like this specific arena or area or sphere that we're looking at, like what's the foundational sort of like premise or premises, right? Because it doesn't have to be just one. So, and there's a lot of different conceptions or ways to think about, like there's different types of first principles, right? And commonly, you could say like religion's a first principle, right? Like why my first principles are in the Bible. I'm a Christian, and I think that the Ten Commandments and the teachings of Jesus or Scripture, that's what I think first principles are. That's where I get my ideas from. Or there are like natural law philosophers or even natural law theologians, and they think that like there are just certain moral laws or principles that are like inherent to human nature, and like so they're first, and they're sort of like first principles would be that natural law is real, that humans are moral creatures, and that we have like moral beliefs like encoded into our behavior. Some stuff's more like loosey goosey, right? Like there's like the common good. You'll hear that a lot. Like, well, we have to do this for the common good, uh, or it can be for like utilitarianism, or it can be like for harmony, or it can be for like the golden rule, right? Those are all kind of ideas of different types of first principles. Within libertarianism, of course, we have our own set of first principles, which really would be self-ownership. The idea that every individual has ownership over their own body. And that even like, some people will try to argue against self-ownership, but it is at least like within the category of something that you can say is a first principle, because it at least has on its face some element of being self-evident, right? It's like if I say I own myself, it's like, well, I'm me and I'm controlling me. So yeah, like if you're going to say like one of my first premises is that I own myself, which it almost reminds me of like, Descartes, like I think therefore I am. It's like, I mean, if you're going to reject that, you're going into like weird philosophical rabbit holes like solipsism, and like, are we just living in a simulation? Are we just brains in a vat? Or do we even, is reality real? So like metaphysics and stuff like that, like kind of comes before even like basic philosophy and first principles. But we're not getting into metaphysics. We're just getting into like, okay, like we like accept reality is real, and like what comes next? Well, libertarian philosophy starts with self-ownership and then argues that based on that foundation, then you have like the next order up, which is still pretty low. You could call it a first principle, but it's not quite. Would be like the non-aggression principle. Like it is a principle, but it's derived from self-ownership. But they're kind of like like a 1-2 punch, right? So they're like your first principles. It's almost like a syllogism, right? You could be like, if I own myself, then other people own themselves. And if people own themselves, then it's a natural conclusion of self-ownership that the initiation of aggression is immoral. People do own themselves, therefore the initiation of aggression is immoral. So like you could say like that's my foundational views, like these are my first principles, right? And again, that's the libertarian set of first principles, and there are other belief systems that have their own. I'm not necessarily an expert in all of them that I could give them to you quite as succinctly as my own, but like utilitarianism or pragmatism, like they also have their own first principles, right? Like pragmatists would say that like if something works, then there is an there's something about it that is true or in accordance with reality, and we can, uh, you know, we should seek to find truth by finding what works or something like that. Like, I'm not. I'm giving you kind of like the layman version of some of this stuff, just to kind of give you the general idea. So let's get back to Konstantin here. So he argues that, like, well, no, Dave, I did give you my foundational principle, right? That my first principles, which is that October 7th happened and it was horrible. And if governments exist, then they have a right to respond to terrorists and to stop them, right? It's basically what he said. I want to play it back here again because I want to hear the first part again of what he said. Let me put it back here.
Then the rest of your arguments naturally derive from that. If, say, for example, if your foundational view is that it was a terrorist attack, then the rest of your arguments naturally derive from that. If, say, your foundational view is that governments have a right and responsibility.
By the way, guys, please go to biblicalanarchypodcast.com and donate to the Libertarian Christian Institute so I can get a producer. So I'm not trying to run all this myself. I kid, kinda. I'm not really kidding, but I'll keep doing it myself anyway, and I'm just having fun. It's like when I watch like Dave and other people and they have producers that do this stuff for them, it's like, man, that's nice. Like, you can just do the commentary. You don't have to like produce your own show while you're trying to think and talk and do it all. LCI does a lot for me. They do the editing, they do a lot of the promotion and all that, but help us expand, right? Give us a bigger budget so we can all have our own personal producers. So yeah, it was like, I just find it really weak, right? Like, he says, well, if your first principle is that October 7th was a terrorist attack, I'm like, that's not, like, that's a question. Like, is this event this definition? Does Y equal X? It's not a first principle. That's a question. Even if you determine that, like, what, your whole worldview, your philosophy is based upon October 7th was a terrorist attack? Like, that, like, it's incoherent. And then he follows it up by saying, well, if governments, if they have a right to and a responsibility to eliminate terrorists and rescue hostages, then the rest of your arguments will derive from that. So, like, there's so much there, and I have a lot I want to talk about tonight in this episode. I don't even know if I'll get to it because I might just get stuck here because, again, it's just so wrong that I don't even know, like I know what I want to say, but it's just finding the point to put your foot in the ground and start going is a little difficult because it's a mess. But so listen, neither of these things could ever be described as self-evident, right? Even like or even if they were, like, maybe like you could say a terrorist attack is somewhat self-evident, although you would need to know certain things about like what distinguishes regular acts of violence from terrorism and have definitions and whatnot. But that's not like a foundational principle for a worldview, right? And then his other thing about government, I want to focus on that. That is not a principle, like a first principle, but that's even higher order up than like the NAP was to self-ownership in terms of conclusions that come from first principles. Because he's basically getting at like social contract theory in an indirect way. He's saying like, well, if governments exist and do they have justified
to eliminate terrorists,
moral authority,
degrade their ability to commit further acts
I don't know
of
why that
terrorism
started playing again.
and rescue hostages from their dungeons, the rest of your arguments will derive.
Again, I need a producer, guys. I must have accidentally clicked it and made it start going again. So the he's saying if governments have a right to exist and they have a right to and a responsibility to respond. He's basically saying like, well, social contract theory is real, Like, but social contract theory being real is like, that's not self-evident because people aren't just going to like know like, oh, I know exactly what social contract theory is, and of course it's real, and that's just self-evident. Uh, Social contract theory is like something we learn in public schools, right? Which it's actually not surprising we're taught that in public schools because this whole system operates off of this theory. But it's like a theory of how the governed give consent to the government and how there's a legitimacy to the state and its authority over individuals. And it's not based in what sets it apart is that people recognize that at the very least, like the sort of authority and agreement between the governed and those who govern is not the same as what we accept everywhere else in society, right? Like, I can't just go to your house and claim that you have to now give me 20% of your wealth annually and give me parts of your land whenever I need it, and I'll put all sorts of rules upon you, right? And violate what would be normally like things that we would normally call theft and we normally call aggression. We go like, well, listen, I know you didn't agree to this stuff explicitly. You didn't actually sign a contract, but we have like an unspoken agreement, right? We have like an implicit contract just because like we need this for society to work. That I just, I have a right to this stuff and you have to give it to me even if you don't really want to. And really, you might not want to, but you did consent to it because of this thing. And I'm giving you my libertarian like slant on social contract theory because obviously as a libertarian, I don't believe in social contract theory. I think that it's actually the whole fundamental point of like Murray Rothbard's critique of the state in Anatomy of the State, which is right behind me. And this is actually just special pleading. It's a bunch of lies that we've told ourselves. But like, let me just take my libertarian hat off for a second. Even if I was going to believe in social contract theory, that's not a first premise. Like, social contract theory is going to have first principles that lead to that, right? So it would have first principles about like assumptions of human nature and like the state of nature. It'd be like, it's where you get the meme of like, we live in a society. So it'd be like, well, humans live in societies and have to find ways to conduct themselves and organize in their complex social structures, right? That's more of that's a little bit of a wordy explanation, but that's closer to a first principle, is that like we live in a society with complex social structures. And then you could say that there's other things that would be layered in social contract theory, like a need for there to be order and justice, right? And a need for there to be something that rectifies order when it becomes disordered, right? Like, essentially, it's like you'd have a bunch of first principles that would then lead to a conclusion that we need a government and that the government doesn't have to be created through the explicit consent of people, but that they have a right to exist. It's like all of this stuff is interesting and worth talking about. And you could make strong arguments for it. Listen, there are people smarter than me throughout history who believed in this stuff. So I don't believe in it, but I'm not trying to act like I don't know, look down on them intellectually. But this is a conclusion, not a first principle. For and beyond that, like, for this to be valid, like to even accept it as true, you have to accept a lot of other things before, like, you can't just, like, with self-ownership, even non-libertarians can kind of go like, yeah, I guess you kind of owned yourself. It makes kind of sense. Or even if they reject it, it's like, okay, but I can see that's your first principle. Like that's just, you don't need, so like argumentation ethics, which is Hoppe's way of like establishing self-ownership. It's just basically like, it's like a very drawn out version of Descartes' I think, therefore I am. It's like, well, you're acting like you own yourself. So I think you own yourself, right? It's like, if you're going to talk to me and engage in an argument, that kind of proves that you think that I'm making the words that come out of my mouth, and you think you're making the words that come out of your mouth, and we're engaged in a dialogue because we both think that we are capable of controlling our bodies and faculties and words and communicating, which demonstrates self-ownership. Like, it's just a complicated way of explaining that it's self-evident. But you can't do that for social contract theory. You'd have to get into uh, all the things I said, and then to claim it's moral, you'd have to, explain why the governments are justified, and why their authority is moral. And then you'd have to get into the second part of this, then, is that even if we got past all that, then it's like, well, how do we know who the terrorists are? Because you said it's defining who counts as terrorists and why, and it's like, the government exists and has the right to go after terrorists and to what was it, like, disarm them and keep them from continuing to attack you and to protect your citizens. Like, okay, but who gets to define who the terrorists are? And how do you know that their view is correct? There's an issue here with just looking at history, that is that there's a lot of examples of conflicts between governments and groups of people who are employing varying levels of force and violence, where you could, you could label it terrorism, but would that actually hold up? I mean, the American Revolution, the colonists' actions. I mean, listen, tarring and feathering politicians could be very much seen as an act of terrorism. The French Revolution, right? And even later than that, when in World War II, when France was under Nazi occupation, well, there was a resistance still, right? And people going into Nazi-controlled areas. It's like, well, how do you know what area is legitimate, what isn't? If an occupied region happens long enough, like, what if Nazi Germany took over France and held it for 50 years, and there was always a small remnant of, French insurgents? It's like, the Nazis might call them terrorists, but does that make it so? The Scottish clans in the 1700s, the Jacobites. There's so many examples throughout history, even like in Africa, in like the conflicts that have happened there, with in South Africa, there was like anti-apartheid movements, and in other countries, there's often, and listen, it's not always even easy, because sometimes it's like you look and you go, the government's corrupt and evil, but these insurgents are also really not that great, right? So it's complicated. And Konstantin's sort of argument here is sort of like begging the question that just like, we trust the state to do this, and it's always simple moral calculation. But history doesn't actually really bear that out, does it? So, yeah, I don't think that this really works. One of the things that I think is useful for determining what a first principle is applying just like the laws of logic to it, right? Like the law of non-contradiction. Self-ownership is, it contains within the law of non-contradiction. But when you're applying it to what Konstantin is saying, it's like, well, what if the government is the terrorist, right? Like, what if they lose? I mean, at one point in American history, the American colonists were criminals. And then, like, fast forward several years, and now they're the government. It's like, so if your view is that, well, the government has the right to go after these terrorists, but then they lose and suddenly it flips, like that sort of that's not a first principle. And then that theory also doesn't really quite hold water with reality. So, yeah, that's anyway, that hopefully that makes sense. I'm going to go back to the video and play some. There's more of what he gets into that I want to talk about, which we will have time to get into. So let's see. I see there are some comments. Oh, hi JC. Nice of you to drop by. Those of you hanging out with me. I'm only doing YouTube tonight. I haven't done just a YouTube only stream in a while. Uh, Posted it on X, but not streaming to X tonight. So probably post the video on X afterwards, though. All right, let's bring this video back up and press play.
From that, how Dave missed this obvious point was initially beyond me, or when he proceeded to the next argument, my confusion abated somewhat. He explains that I was wrong to make a per capita comparison of October 7th to 9/11. If you recall, I argued that given that Israel has a population of just 9 million people, having 1,200 of them killed, hundreds more dragged off to Gaza against their will, and thousands wounded, was comparable to a much greater number of people being killed in a country of 300 million people like the US. He calls this view bizarre, before saying that my comparison is like saying you have two families, one with 4 kids, another with 2. If you kill one of their kids, it's basically the same. The problem here is that Dave has deliberately changed the maths. Imagine you had a family with 12 kids and a family with 1. Yes, the act of killing one child from each family is the same moral evil, but the impact is completely different. But this isn't the real giveaway. The reason Dave fails to understand the first principles from which I'm arguing is that his own get in the way. At the core of his argument is the idea that all people think the same. We'll see more of this later. This becomes very clear when he says that
if you're going to use this argument, which I'm saying flat out I reject, but then why doesn't the same argument apply to the Palestinians?
This is further clarified when his co-host explains,
yeah, there's something inhumane about the proportions of death talk, which is what they keep trying to spin as the arguments with the amount of civilians that are killed to soldier ratios.
Note how the argument has suddenly been twisted. We were debating whether a terrorist attack is more impactful in a smaller country than a bigger one. Now, we're rejecting the very concept of war itself. It's inhumane to analyze the ratio of combatants to civilians killed. By this logic, if Israel only killed Hamas fighters, they would still be committing genocide, because it's inhumane to differentiate between the deaths of rapist jihadis and those of innocent civilians. What? But
Okay, this is so wrong. Like, it's actually, I don't know how he gets it 100% wrong, but he does. Because what Dave and Rob's point is that, so listen, like, there's a lot of apologetics, right? And some people will say that Israel, actually compared to other countries, well, their civilian to assailant or target, ratio is better than others. Granted, that's I don't know if that's really true. I think it depends on how you count the civilian death total in Gaza and elsewhere, and whose numbers you're using. But so he's also conflating two different things here. The first point was Dave responding to Konstantin about him saying that October 7th was like 20 or some ridiculously high number amount of 9/11s to Israel, because Israel has a smaller population. So it's worse for them. I don't even know why this really matters so much, but so the only way this would matter, this is a small point. This only matters if Konstantin's point is that, oh, well, Israel's just that much more emotionally worked up over this than America was over 9/11. But that wouldn't really do anything but bolster Dave and my side of this argument's position, right? Because it's like, if your point is like, well, this was so much worse and it's so much more emotionally impactful, so Israel's just that much more angry and, determined to get revenge, it's like, okay, well, I mean, maybe you have a point, but that doesn't make it right. Like, people getting caught up in anger and revenge over, wrongs that have been done to them doesn't mean that they're acting logically or, within reason or, measured in their response, right? But further, I just don't think, like, there's a category error there. And maybe it's somewhat true, right? Like, yeah, America sometimes, like, especially after 9/11, could have that idea of, like, a nation being somewhat akin to a family. And, maybe Israel, because it's a little bit more homogenous and smaller, maybe they have that more. But the point is, like, it's one thing to say that maybe the emotional impact is bigger, but that doesn't really help establish any more legitimacy to what Israel is doing. And the point is that it can be a little bit misleading, because if you're saying it's like 29/11, then you can make it out to be like Hamas and the Palestinians killed like an extraordinarily high number of people, when that's not actually, like, they didn't kill 20,000 people. They killed like something closer to 1,200, although we don't even know how many, because of the Hannibal doctrine and, other, a lack of actual reporting and investigation to be, done. Israeli government standing in the way of this. We don't actually have a way to verify how many of these deaths came from Hamas and how many might have came from friendly fire and confusion that happened in the heat of the conflict of October 7th. So anyway, it doesn't seem to me to, I mean, you guys can let me know in the comments, but that doesn't really seem to me to be like an argument that, I'm not going to waste too much time on it, but it doesn't seem to even help his cause that much. It's like, if your point is just that Israel's really angry because it's so much worse, because it's so much more devastating, it's like, okay, but that, like, I as a human, I get that. As a father, I get that. But that doesn't have any bearing on if the Israeli government's actions are justified or not. So, all right, let's keep going here.
Since they've asked, the reason the same argument does not apply to Palestinians is encapsulated in the term casus belli. Defined as an act or situation that provokes or justifies a war, the term has been with us for centuries because people have long recognized that, sad as war is, it is sometimes the right response. In fact, if you had to get people to agree on the circumstances which might trigger a just war, a cross-border raid in which 1,000 people are killed and hundreds taken hostage would be close to top of the list. The purpose of Israel's Gaza operation is to eliminate the terrorists who attacked them, recover the hostages they took, and make sure Hamas can't carry out their threat of repeating October 7 as many times as possible.
Is it to get the hostages back? Because they've done next to nothing to get the hostages back, Konstantin. Like, next to nothing. They don't want to get the hostages back. At least not as much as they want to keep fighting. They don't want to give up. They don't want to do, like, exchanges, right? They don't want to. Israel has done things in the past to get hostages back, and they're not doing that now. And it seems awfully convenient that by not getting the hostages back, they continue to have that as a rallying cry for why they have to continue this fight, even though if they really wanted the hostages back, they could negotiate to get them at almost any point, but they're just not willing to do the negotiation. Which, man, can you imagine that? Like, if you're the family members of one of those hostages and, like, your government is like, we're not going to negotiate to get your wife back or your kid back or your father back because, it's just not politically advantageous to us. It's like, who cares? You could still go after Hamas later. Get the hostage. If you care about the hostages, get them back. It's been over a year at this point. So, yeah, sorry. That's not even a legitimate point there at all. In terms of the just war, I've done a whole episode on just war theory. It's a very interesting theory. It says that war is justified and it gives a lot of limitations on it, but it says one of the most important things is that if all possible means of peace and avoiding conflict and de-escalating conflict have been exhausted, does Israel funneling money from Qatar and other places to Hamas to keep them in power as part of a explicitly admitted to plan to divide the Palestinians to prevent a two-state process and halt to literally word for word to put formaldehyde to the peace process to keep the international community off of us so that we can continue the status quo? Does that sound like exhausting all efforts for peace? Doesn't quite sound like it, does it? Furthermore, you can't quite have it both ways, because he's saying that because like I would not use the argument that Hamas is really a government. This isn't like a nation state, right? I mean, if it was, they'd be living in a two-state solution now, but they're not. Instead, but what Konstantin's doing is trying to have his cake and eat it too, which all the pro-Israel, sorry, there's ambulances going by if you hear that. All the pro-Israel advocates like to do that. So they like to say that the Hamas is the government, Palestinians voted them in, so they're just as bad. They could rise up and overthrow their government at any point, right, if they really wanted to. But Konstantin said that governments have a right to identify terrorists and to try to, hold on, what was the word for word quotation here? They have a right and responsibility to eliminate terrorists and degrade their ability to commit further acts of terrorism and rescue hostages from their dungeons. Man, what would you call like a group of people who were locking you in a geographic area for decades after kicking you out of your homes, routinely dropping bombs on you, controlling your borders, having control over your water and your electricity and things like that. Yeah, it doesn't quite strike me that Konstantin really like understands how he's hanging himself with this argument, because it's just all subjective, right? To Israel, it's like, well, they started it. They're the terrorists because they've killed innocent people, and so therefore we're justified in declaring war, and once war is declared, there are no rules. We can do whatever we need to end the war and any innocent lives that are lost. It's Hamas's fault. They're responsible. But you know what Hamas says? Says, well, these Zionists and these, I'm using their language, these Jews in Israel have been occupying us and bombing us and killing our families for decades, and they're terrorizing us and they're a threat to us, and so we have a right to engage in resistance and in combat to try to liberate and protect our people. Now, am I saying Hamas is a bunch of angels and Israel is the devil? No. I'm saying that quite the opposite. Hamas is a terrorist group. Unfortunately, the Israeli government, like most governments, bears much more in common with the terrorist group than it does a group of people who are earnestly interested in pursuing and creating peace and prosperity for their people. And that's Dave's entire argument. All right, let's keep going here. Running a little bit short on time.
Possible. The purpose of October 7, on the other hand, was to kill, maim, rape, and torture civilians. That's the difference. Next, Dave challenges my claim that most countries are created through the displacement of the native population. For example, I asked, would the US tolerate missile strikes and terrorist rampages from Native American reservations? We wouldn't just start bombing, he says, outraged by the mere suggestion.
So you know what would happen next? The fucking police go in and they try to find the people who did it.
This, I'm afraid, is where he lost me. Hamas, the elected government of Gaza, orchestrated October 7th using its army of 25,000 fighters who have multiple rocket launch systems, heat-seeking surface-to-air missiles, Shahab suicide drones, anti-tank mines, Cornet laser-guided anti-tank missiles, RPGs, 50 caliber sniper rifles, automatic weapons, grenades, IEDs and booby traps. And Israel should deal with that by sending cops. Having got this far into the 83-minute video, I gave up. Again, let me repeat, I do think Dave is smart. Some of the arguments he makes are logically sound. The problem is that he starts from bad priors, as he explains in this clip.
We're all kind of the same when it comes to this. Like after 9/11, we got hit and some innocent people got killed. And we went, you know what? You hit us, we're going to go get you. Like if you do that to us, we're going to, you think you could just kill us? We're going to go kill a whole bunch of you. And then you kind of realize it's like, yeah, that's exactly how those people who flew the buildings into the.
So this is, I'm going to let this play out because this gets into the last set of arguments that Konstantin makes that I really want to get into. So just bear with me. I wish, can you on Twitter, because I'm playing this off Twitter, I want to speed this up a little bit, not too much.
The towers felt exactly the same way you feel right now.
This is a cognitive error called mirror image bias, well known to analysts who study other cultures. They spend years training precisely to understand that not all people are the same, nor do they act for the same reasons. As it happens, jihadis like bin Laden have been telling us why they attack us for years. We just don't listen because what they say makes us very uncomfortable. Between 2014 and 2016, ISIS published a monthly magazine called Dabiq. Issue 15 includes a short article entitled Why We Hate You and Why We Fight You. I have summarized it for brevity here, but the entire article titled Why They Hate Us is available on my Substack. Here's what they say. 1. We hate you first and foremost because you are disbelievers. You reject the oneness of Allah. Furthermore, just as your disbelief is the primary reason we hate you and fight you, as we have been commanded to fight the disbelievers until they submit to the authority of Islam, either by becoming Muslims or by paying jizya and living in humiliation under the rule of Muslims, even if you were to stop fighting us, your best case scenario would be that we would suspend our attacks against you in order to focus on the closer and more immediate threats, before eventually resuming our campaigns against you. You cannot halt our war against you. At most, you could only delay it temporarily. 2. We hate you because your secular liberal societies permit the very things that Allah has prohibited while banning many of the things he has permitted. Your secular liberalism has led you to tolerate and even support gay rights, to allow alcohol, drugs, fornication, gambling, and usury to become widespread, and to encourage the people to mock those who denounce these filthy sins and vices. As such, we wage war against you to stop you from spreading your disbelief and debauchery, your secularism and nationalism, your perverted liberal values, your Christianity and atheism, and all the depravity and corruption they entail. 3. In the case of the atheist fringe, we hate you and wage war against you because you disbelieve in the existence of your Lord and Creator. 4. We hate you for your crimes against Islam and wage war against you to punish you for your transgressions against our religion. As long as your subjects continue to mock our faith, insult the prophets of Allah, burn the Quran, and openly vilify the laws of the Sharia, we will continue to retaliate not with slogans and placards, but with bullets and knives. 5. We hate you for your crimes against the Muslims. Your drones and fighter jets bomb, kill, and maim our people around the world, and your puppets in the usurped lands of the Muslims oppress, torture, and wage war against anyone who calls to the truth. 6. We hate you for invading our lands and fight you to repel you and drive you out. As long as there is an inch of territory left for us to reclaim, jihad will continue to be a personal obligation on every single Muslim. Now, I know what you're thinking. See, Konstantin, Dave was right all along. The people who flew the planes into the towers, ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the rest, are just rightly upset at the West for its foreign policy and at Israel for its occupation. That's what they just said. There's only one problem with this. ISIS knew you'd say that, so they added this bit at the end just for you. What's important to understand here is that although some might argue that your foreign policies are what drives our hatred, they're talking about you, Dave, this particular reason for hating you is secondary, hence the reason we addressed it at the end. Even if you were to stop bombing us, we would continue to hate you because our primary reason for hating you will not cease to exist until you embrace Islam. Even if you were to pay jizya and live under the authority of Islam in humiliation, we would continue to hate you. What's equally, if not more important to understand, is that we fight you not simply to punish and deter you, but to bring you true freedom and salvation. We fight you in order to bring you out from the darkness and disbelief and into the light of Islam. If you enjoy these videos, remember...
All right, so that's the end of that video. So I'm going to close that out and finish with I'm going to try to get my final thoughts in here in less than 5 minutes. Probably not going to happen. I'm sorry. There's been like 5 or 6 ambulances, fire trucks going past me. I don't even know if you guys can hear it, to be honest, but I can hear it. So, all right. There is so much wrong with that. And it's like, again, all right. So, just like right off the bat, he's reading the what is it called? Like the charter or something? He's reading this document, right, to prove a point. Like, look at all this stuff that they're saying about why they hate us, right? And it's from ISIS. ISIS is not Hamas. Like, I don't ever, like, I'm not going to say racist, right? Because that's like a dumb leftist thing. But like, this is something that like the left would, like, if they were going to like call this racist, it would have like at least some semblance of being kind of true. Because it's like, what, you just think every Arab extremist group is just the same? Just like, oh, Al-Qaeda is like the Taliban, which is like Hamas, which is like the PL. They're just all the same because they're just the violent Muslims. Oh God, like it's just it literally hurts. No, like, okay, so Hamas and ISIS actually not the same. Hamas is very much concerned with the Palestinian cause, where ISIS is a global jihadist movement with, yeah, it does have broader goals, right? Not really the same. But there's also a problem, like, just beyond that, beyond like moving the goalpost from talking about Hamas and Hamas's goals and what Hamas wants and making it about ISIS and using ISIS as a proxy for all, disgruntled Muslims in the Middle East and across the world. There's a worse problem here, which is that he's actually kind of really missing the point about how ISIS kind of proves our point. Because ISIS, like, what did they come out of? They came out of 20 years of war and occupation in Iraq and Afghanistan and all the interventions in Syria and all that around that. And those actions created ISIS. So before ISIS, we had bin Laden and the Taliban. Bin Laden did have things to say about not liking the West because of our secular values and things like that. But his focus was much more about the 500,000 dead Iraqi children from all the sanctions that we did and the regime change in Iran and the constant occupations and drone strikes and bombings and things like that. I guess there weren't drone strikes necessarily back then, but missile strikes. And I don't know, like, what, you think after 20 years of that, they were going to get less extreme in their religious fundamentalism? So, again, here's the problem. He doesn't actually understand history. Because when you go back and you study, and this isn't just America, when you go back and study Zionism, you go back and study the Middle East, and you look at like the late 1800s through World War I, then in the early 1900s, and then World War II and the creation of Israel, and then fast forward, like, you start to see a pattern. You see a pattern which, like, recently happened even in our own time. It even recently happened with Israel and Hamas, which is that Western powers, for their own political gain, for their own military dominance and benefit, for their own imperial dreams and manifestations that they want to make reality, for their own greed and lust for power, continue continually repeat this pattern of supporting and propping up violent, or at least like more religious, fundamentalist, and extreme groups and leaders within the Muslim world, and cutting off, killing, discrediting, at the very least sabotaging the reformers and even the secularists in the Middle Eastern world. That happens time and time and time again. Like, there's so many, like, you go back and listen to the Daryl Cooper's podcast, the Martyr Made podcast. He does a great job at talking about this as it relates to what, Britain did and what America and the United Nations later did. I've had talks with Scott Horton about this on my show too. I don't have Scott Horton level recall to get into too many specific examples. But we even saw this with Zionism, right? It's like there's often within all of these groups, there are your moderates and your extremists. But we are often like funding the extremists for our own end, like how we funded bin Laden to fight against the Russians in the Cold War, right? And when you continue to occupy these regions and you continue to bomb these people over and over again, the psychological trauma of war is going to drive more and more people into these extremist ideologies. So yes, you would expect that American interventionism, that these damned neocon hawk policies that you, Konstantin Kisin, are becoming an apologist for, carrying water for, the neocon agenda to make sure that the American empire, that the sun never sets on it. That's what you're doing. When this continues, yeah, the violent extremism and the religious fundamentalism gets worse. Yeah, here in the West, you hear once in a while about someone like joining ISIS. But we don't have a major problem here with a bunch of violent Muslims or violent Arabs, or even for that matter, violent Christians or violent, like, we have some violence, we have some mental health issues, we have some gang violence in the inner cities. We don't have a lot of problems of religious strife and war and religious extremism, because what draws people to that is living in extreme, desperate, war-torn, occupied, liberty-stripped circumstances and situations for decades, or worse, like even beyond just living in occupation and in like tyranny. What really is going to inspire a whole lot of people to pick up guns or strap bombs to themselves is watching their loved ones blown to bits in front of them, especially like when they're children. I mean, like, what about like Ron Paul and Pat Buchanan and so many people over the last 10, 20 years, like saying like, hey, the bombs you're dropping today are creating the terrorists of tomorrow, because the 5-year-old who now has his mother and father's guts and splattered all over the remnants of rubble that used to be his house, do you think he's going to grow up liking the West? You think he's going to grow up liking Israel? Or do you think it's going to be real easy for the religious fundamentalists to recruit him to their cause? And that's what makes me so angry about watching this video, is just like, how can you see this and not only get it wrong, but get it like 100% wrong, like literally 180 degrees in the wrong direction? I'll end on this. Listen, yeah, I'm not a pacifist, and Hamas should be stopped. But at some point, someone has also got to recognize the cycle of violence that this region is in and say, you know what, we have to be the bigger people here and, not keep repeating the same mistakes. We have to stop creating more victims and stop creating the circumstances which fuel this violent religious extremism. And some people go like, oh, the Muslims have always been violent. It's like, yeah, the Muslims had their time of conquest, and so did the Christians, and the Jews are getting their turn in the sun with Israel, is what I would argue. It's like, so what? I'm not even a fan of Islam. I'm not even saying there's not anything about Islam that maybe makes it more susceptible. But you know what? Like, scenario A, scenario B. Scenario A is Muslims living in a country where they have their rights protected, and where their children and neighbors aren't blown to bits around them, and where they are able to leave if they want to and are not locked in to a particular area, versus scenario B, where all those things are the opposite. Like, what's going to breed more terrorism and violence? It's not rocket scientists. It's not rocket science. So, yeah, all that to say, I guess if I'm going to make some kind of conclusions here, I'm going to recap. Konstantin doesn't have any idea what first principles means, and he has no logical consistency to the things he does try to push as his first principles. He doesn't show a real sophisticated understanding of the history, of human psychology, of the role of Western interventionism in making ISIS in the first place. You know what solves all this? Real first principles, like an understanding of self-ownership and the non-aggression principle. First principles that apply consistently, where people like Dave and I can go, you know what? I don't side with Hamas or Netanyahu and the Likud party. I side with the innocent people and against these tyrannical governments. And I'm not going to have my ANCAP paradise tomorrow, but I can at least demand these governments stop being butchers. I can be upset when Hamas butchers innocent Israeli children, and I can say, you know what? I understand what led to that was Israel's government butchering innocent Palestinian children. And you know what's not going to make this situation any better? Butchering another 15,000 or so Palestinian children, 30,000 plus, I forget the exact count, civilian deaths since last year. How many? That's the question I've been asking on Twitter lately. How many? What's the number? How many dead Palestinians till we have peace? The only honest answer is all of them. The only honest answer is, if you're looking to create peace through violence and continuing this path, you're just gonna have to kill them all. But then don't pretend that Western civilization is superior anymore. Don't pretend that Western values mean a damn. Don't pretend that we're civilized. Like Dave said, we're really not that much different than they are. And that's not, whatever you call it, like psychological mirroring of cultures or whatnot. That's calling just being honest to the own devil that lives inside of you. Which is something that I'm disappointed Jordan Peterson doesn't understand more. And that's going to be next week's episode, is taking some more swipes at Jordan Peterson. So that's all I have for you guys today. I appreciate you guys staying with me through my responding to this, some of my angry monologuing. But it's cathartic, and I hope it makes somewhat of an impact. That's all we can do, right? I have 5 kids of my own. I can't imagine what I would do if some government, dropped a bomb on my house and I lost my entire family. I have no idea what that would do to me. The least I can do for the families who are suffering through this across the world is try to do my part in my own little place of the world to try to call for peace, call for sanity. So that's all we have for you guys for tonight, and be back again with you guys sometime. Let's see here, Do I have a stream? No, it is Thursday. I was about to say I have a stream Thursday, but it is Thursday. I'll probably be back here Monday night with another live stream. So make sure wherever you're at, if you could please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already. Greatly appreciate that. Again, as it says there on the bottom, libertarianchristians.com/donate. It all helps. I know everyone's got their own stuff going on, so even if you can't donate, just liking this, subscribing it, sharing it. Heck, make clips of this and share it around if you want to. I do that myself, but I appreciate every single one of you who tunes in and listens and watches. So, all right, I'm going to play the outro, and I'll talk to you guys on Monday.